Welcome back to ReadingBear. Today, we will take a look at some new revenge stories. And if you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. Let's go!
The first one is titled, Oil Change Place Refuses to Pay for Damages. In 1993 I bought a 1992 Saturn, nice car, low mileage, ran great. I had been taking my cars to the same place for a few years for oil changes. Place was named after a certain Looney Tunes character that went beep beep and even used that purple-headed bird in their logo. One day in 1995 I had to run an errand across town right after the oil change. Sometimes there might be some smoke from oil getting on the exhaust headers, so I didn't think much of it when I saw a bit right after starting my car. I got on the highway and after several miles noticed smoke was coming out from under the hood. I pulled over and popped the hood to find the oil filler cap sitting in the valley of the valve cover instead of screwed down over the filler opening. Oil was everywhere, engine bay was soaked. I checked the oil and was 2 quarts low. I walked to a gas station, got oil and topped it off and turned to head right back to the oil change place. I didn't make it. The check engine light came on, the car started stumbling and running rough, and I managed to make it to the Oldsmobile dealer, thinking GM product I had done business with before. They took the car in while I called to cancel my appointment and call the oil change place to lodge a complaint. They told me they couldn't do anything, I had to call the boss. I got his number and called. This is where it starts getting fun. He basically told me it was my problem, he changes 90 cars a day and can't be expected to get everyone right. I told him he would be responsible for the damage to my car and he would be hearing back from me. Old's dealer told me the alternator was saturated in oil, being right behind the oil fill hole, and was shot. They had to go to the Saturn dealer for the alternator as it was not a standard GM part. Next day I get my car back, $450 to fix, needed a battery too. I call the oil change owner and he tells me to send him the receipts. I figure good, gonna get this taken care of in no time. Nope, I call a week later and he says with my car having 52,000 miles on it, he can't be sure it was the oil change that caused it. He even refused a refund on the oil change. I went back and forth with him for 3 months, he would flip-flop between being cooperative and combative, but never getting anything done. Finally I decided to sue. I filed and his response to the notification was that he wasn't responsible if his employees messed up someone's car. Since I am not familiar with this process, I asked the court clerk what to expect, and she became a library of info. I followed her advice, brought a ton of paperwork, showed up in a suit and tie to court, and explained my case to the judge. The oil change guy showed up in a pair of jeans that should have been thrown in the trash, complained that he was a small business owner and shouldn't be held accountable for his employees' actions. Suffice to say, judge ruled in my favor. I asked the court clerk what to do next and her reply was to lay low and do nothing. He had 30 days to appeal, and if I did nothing, he would think I was happy and wouldn't appeal. A month later she confirmed that he did not appeal. I then sent him a registered letter stating that he owed me the $450 plus $75 for court filing fee. My letter was carefully worded and stated that if he didn't pay I would file lien on his business. He called the day the letter was received and told me a check would be in the mail as soon as possible. It did take another month for the check to come in, but I did get paid. As I mentioned, it took 3 months for me to get tired of his crap, so I decided to check on whether he had legal right to use the beep beep bird material. Note this was before internet days. I made several calls and finally got a hold of W. Bro's legal department in Burbank, CA. The lawyer I talked with was very interested in what I had for her and gave me her mailing address to send the information on the oil change place. A short time later a friend who knew of my troubles told me I needed to drive by the place, so I did. Less than 2 weeks after I sent the materials, including a copy of my receipt, the Yellow Pages ad, his business card, and photos of the place, the signage was covered with a sheet, no beep beep bird related stuff in sight. A week later the place had a new name and new logo. Now if this guy had just paid for his mistake up front, it would have been simple and done. As he chose to be a jerk, it wound up costing him a lot more. The next one is titled, I Don't Know Why Your Car Won't Start. So here's the story. My older brother is a huge piece of crap. Like puts $200 of charges on my dad's credit card. Piece of crap. One weekend he decided he was going to drive to Chicago to see his friends. He is very irresponsible with his finances, and spends the majority of a paycheck in 1 week, claiming it is for gas. Well anyways, he barged into my room asking if I could lend him money. I refused, knowing full well I would never see it again. He kept prying at me, trying to get me to agree. At the time, I had just gotten my first job. I was 14 and did not have a debit card or account yet. I only had cash. Sitting in my wallet was around $400 I had earned from fixing computers for neighbors and friends. I wasn't going to give him any of it. Later that night, I was lying in my bed, eyes were closed. I heard somebody walk into my room. I opened my eyes just a little bit. It was my brother. He grabbed all of the cash out of my wallet. I didn't do anything. A few moments later, I heard him start his car. I figured he had just gone to Chicago and I was ducked. Around 15 minutes later, I heard him come back. Revenge time. I heard him close his bedroom door. I waited around 2 hours, until it was around midnight. I snuck downstairs, grabbed a flashlight, and headed outside. He had locked his car, so I headed back inside, and searched through my mum's purse for the spare. Sorry mum. I didn't steal anything though. I headed back out and opened the car door. I popped open the hood and took a look at what I could duck up. He was destined to leave the following morning. I didn't just want to disconnect his battery. I opened up the fuse box that holds the relays for the starter, and just about anything that actually makes the car run. Using some pliers, I popped every single one out, took them to the driveway, and beat the crap out of them with a hammer. I wanted to do something like put the bits on his seat, but he weighed like 210 and could easily break every bone in my 140-pound body. Instead I threw them out, and waited to collect my reward the next morning. I woke up early, only running on 6 hours of sleep. He walked down the stairs carrying some bags, grunted at me and walked out the door. I was on my phone nonchalantly browsing Reddit. Around 10 minutes later, I hear his car door shut, followed up by it opening, then the hood popping. At this time, my brother was pretty illiterate on how cars worked. The battery was connected, so he figured it had died. At 6 a.m. he ducking storms into the house. My car won't start. Me, maybe you could get mum to give you a jump start in a couple of hours. I can't wait that long. I have to go now. Though I was 14, I had a 2004 Ford Ranger with 14k miles on it that I had been working on for 2 years that would be mine at 15. He threw his keys down on the table next to me. What about the Ranger? Can that jump start it? Me getting more ideas on how to duck with him. Probably. Well help me then. I got the keys and backed it out of my garage into the driveway. I purposefully came out at an angle, missing his car by about 1/4 of an inch. He was so ducking sweaty and angry. I backed up more and tried to drive around his car to get to a position where I could jump start his car. Just as I got behind it, I turned the car off. I pretended surprised. I popped the hood, and took the relay out so it wouldn't start. My brother came over in a huff. It died. Duck. He tried to start it 400 times. He never got to go to Chicago, and ended up towing his car to a shop where they charged him $900 to put in just new fuses. I never got my money back, but honestly, I'm okay with that. The next one is titled, "Lady Purposely Hit My Truck Because She Didn't Like Where I Parked So I Got Revenge with Mice." I was visiting my cousin who lives on a street that has no garages and very few driveways. So everyone parks on the street. This makes for a lot of people having to find parking where they can and walk to their house since the parking is scarce. I park across the street from his house at the first open space. There's no reserved parking, handicapped signs or anything. It's just street parking. When I come out to leave, a car has parked in front of me, but it's actually hit my truck and still sitting there touching it. It didn't do a ton of damage, but it did dent my bumper and my grille. I assume the driver just didn't realize what they did. It's not a big enough deal to call the cops, and I don't know what house they're attached to since few people end up lucky enough to park in front of their own house. I'm basically going to forget about it unless I see the car's owner. I snapped some pics and wrote down the license plate. Just then another neighbor comes out and tells me he watched the car park and that the driver was mad someone had parked in front of her house. And she had her passenger get out and direct her to back up enough to just barely hit my truck to teach me a lesson about parking in front of her house. The neighbor tells me about how she's done this before to other people's cars, how everyone on the street hates her, how he's caught her red-handed putting her extra garbage bags next to his trash can on garbage day, because she thought he'd already gone to work. Those extra bags cost extra to haul. That she's taken people, cats and dogs to the animal shelter and instructed them to be put down, dumped dog poop on the cars of people she thinks own the dogs, etc. Just a real witch of a woman. So I'm upset now, and rather than confront her and need to get police involved, I just decided to get revenge. First I took a diabetic syringe and shot some super glue into all the house's exterior door locks. Then me and my cousin had drinks on his front porch while we waited for her to get home. When she got there I saw a spinster grouchy-faced lady in her late 40s early 50s. She gave us a glare for no reason as she got out of her car. She of course couldn't get her key to work, and we watched her try to get in her house for an hour before a locksmith showed up. He couldn't figure it out either. She ended up getting a contractor to come out and break in, then replaced all the locks. She never had a clue why it stopped working. I wasn't finished yet though. The next day I went there with a can of pepper spray and I sprayed her front door handle with it. Pepper spray leaves behind a slight oily residue. People touch their face way more than they realize. So again waited on the porch with cousin to see her come home. 15 minutes after she got home she comes running outside holding her face and screaming. She tries to get in her car but can't see to drive. We ask her if she's okay and she doesn't know, so we call an ambulance and she goes to the hospital. Comes home and says doctor thinks it's an allergic reaction. And instead of thanking us for helping her, instead says if we were decent neighbors we'd have driven her to the hospital and saved her the cost of the ambulance. Tells us we're as worthless as everyone else on this street. So I decide I'm still not done. So I wait a few days and drove to visit my cousins again, and her car isn't around. So I walk around her house just inspecting. I see a small broken window pane in a basement window. She has an unfinished basement, you can see through the dirty glass. So I went to the local pet store and bought 100 grey mice, making sure to get 50 males and 50 females, plus some rodent food. So I went back to her house and dumped all 100 through the broken window along with sneaky dropping in the food. Do you realize how fast 100 breeding pair mice will turn into 1,000? 10,000? So a month later she has major exterminators over, and a week after that she puts her house up for sale. All the neighbors bad-mouthed the house to all the potential buyers, and she ended up accepting an offer over 100k less than her asking price. Good riddance. Now nice people live there. Karma's a witch. The last one is titled, "That's Not Your Car, Lady." So this happened around 2008. My buddy Brock had gotten out of the military after 10 years. He'd started in the Marines but transitioned into the Army for the last 4 years before buying a house in Texas. When he got out he did a variety of jobs before landing a gig with a Repo service. He worked there for a year and had a lot of wild stories, but this one sticks out the most as he helped a fellow soldier get revenge on an evil ex. Brock was at the office speaking with his manager, whom I'll refer to as Karen. Now this particular Karen had a lot of Karen-like qualities but was a force for good, if you can believe that. While they were talking they see a young man enter the office. They immediately noticed he had 2 black eyes and an arm was in a sling. The young man, whose name I unfortunately never learned but I'll call Ben, asked how hard it would be for them to help repossess his car. Karen called her daughter in, Karen Jr., and had her pour Ben a cup of coffee. Karen then asked Ben to tell her a story. Ben began with telling her that he had just returned from a deployment. He had been dating a local girl that lived outside of the famous Fort Hood, not a good idea by the way, before the deployment. Thanks to a previous deployment he had managed to get himself a used black Dodge Charger, which was his baby. He further explained that shortly after buying the car he had met the local girl, who for the sake of the story I'll call Morgan. Morgan was always asking to drive his car but he would always decline. When he was getting ready for his deployment, Morgan repeatedly asked if she could borrow the car but he kept saying no. After much needling he relented, but on the condition that she take care of his apartment until he comes back from rest and relaxation leave. She agreed. Ben left for his deployment while Morgan took care of his place. When Ben came back for leave he found his apartment immaculate. He pulled his car from storage, drove to Morgan's. He spent a few days with her before handing her the keys and heading to his home state to visit family before returning to his deployment. He returned again from his deployment and found nothing but trouble. When he walked into his apartment he found a layer of dust on just about every surface. It was almost like no one had been there in months. When he checked his bedroom he'd found his room had been torn apart, all of his drawers had been searched and upturned. He tried to call Morgan but never received an answer. He located his safe, which was hidden, and found it hadn't been touched. He then grabbed his spare key from the safe, called a buddy of his and they went to Morgan's. As they pulled up to Morgan's he saw a car there that he initially didn't recognize, but as they got closer he realized it was his baby. Morgan had the car painted hot pink and put 24-inch spinners on it. He tried the key just to make sure and the lights flickered as it unlocked. While his buddy laughed, Ben went to the front door and Morgan answered. He asked what happened to his car and she responded, "It's my car now." Ben walked away and hopped in his hot pink mess. As he started it, 4 large dudes came out of Morgan's house, one with a baseball bat, and yanked Ben out of his car. They proceeded to beat the crap out of him in the driveway before his friend intervened, pulling his conceal and carry pistol on the group. He then took Ben to the hospital. I'm honestly not sure if the cops were called on this. I'd assume yes, but even then Ben said his friend drove by Morgan's house a handful of times while he was in the hospital at random times and the car was never there. Karen stared at Ben for a bit before asking for the paperwork. Ben handed it to her and Karen had a smile form on her face. She then asked Ben for Morgan's phone number. Ben gave it but wasn't aware of what was about to happen. Karen handed the phone to Karen Jr., who then dialed the number. Karen Jr. then began speaking to Morgan, telling her that they'd met at one of the local clubs and wanted to know if she was down to party that night. Apparently Morgan agreed and the plan was set. Brock parked his tow truck at the club and waited. Sure enough, Morgan showed up with the pink monster, parked it, and went inside with some girlfriends. Brock gave them 5 minutes before he stealthily drove up to the car and hooked it up. As he was pulling out with the pink monster, Morgan walked out of the club. She saw her car in the tow truck and began trying to flag Brock down, but he was already out of there. The next day it was business as usual at the office when Morgan called. She was furious that her car was stolen by them and wanted it back. Karen, using her best customer service voice, told her if she had the registration she could come pick it up. Morgan began screaming louder that she was gonna call the cops, at which point Karen sarcastically told her, "Please do," then hung up on her. As this phone call was going on, Brock happened to look out the window and saw Morgan standing next to a car in a vacant lot, throwing what appeared to be a temper tantrum. After Karen hung up, Brock watched her get in the car on the passenger side. Karen then looked out the window and had Brock verify it was her. She then began to smirk. Karen then proceeded to call the owner of the property Morgan and her friend were occupying. She told the owner about the car and asked if he wanted it towed. The owner okayed it. Brock then drove his truck over to the ladies in the car and introduced himself. They tried to explain that they were waiting for Morgan's boyfriend, but Brock insisted they weren't allowed to park there. They argued and called him every name in the book. Brock then hooked up their car and lifted it partially off the ground, forcing the two to exit the vehicle. They tore into him until he showed them the tow order. While this back and forth was going on, Ben arrived at the office and Morgan saw him walk in. She ran to the office door and Brock proceeded to lower the car. When Brock went back to the office, all hell had broken loose. Morgan apparently tried to snag the keys back from Ben, but he pocketed them. She began to hit him in his hurt arm and warned Ben that she'd call her friends to finish the job if she didn't get her keys back. Karen Jr. had already called the cops at this point, and Brock got in between Ben and Morgan, even telling Morgan to try hitting him to find out what would happen. Morgan then tried to play the pity card and said she only wanted the keys to get her laptop out for school. Karen asked Ben to hand the keys over to Brock so he could grab the laptop. Brock retrieved the laptop from the car, and as he was handing it over, she rushed to aggressively grab it but knocked it from Brock's hands. Completely furious at this point, Morgan accused Brock of dropping the computer on purpose and threatened to sue. The cops then arrived and Morgan began her sob story again, telling the police that they stole her car. The police questioned Karen and Karen gave her casual smirk while asking if they wanted to see the security videos. The police watched and listened as Morgan punched Ben several times and heard the threats she made about sending her friends after him. The police then turned to Morgan, who had turned ghost white at this point. She tried to back her way to the door, but the police stopped her. They proceeded to ask about the car, Ben's injuries, and who she planned on sending after him. She initially denied everything, but they already had evidence on her beating him up. She was arrested and Ben got his car back. After the cops left, Ben admitted he didn't want to be seen in a car that looked like it was advertising Pepto-Bismol and planned on trading it in for a GTO. We later heard through the grapevine that the 4 guys who beat up Ben were arrested. Morgan had ratted them out. Brock had a few more stories, but none of them were nearly as good as this one. Thanks for listening.